Good afternoon. This afternoon, we're going to talk about exigent circumstances. Exigent circumstances is a very important part of criminal law, criminal procedure, and admissions of evidence that maybe should have been excluded or should have been suppressed. When we talk about exigent circumstances, it's generally used to help the police officers to get into a person's home, remember, or place of abode. Remember, there are only a few reasons for which police officers can get into the home because it has the greatest degree of protection under the Fourth Amendment. One of those reasons are consent with a warrant or exigent circumstances. Now, with exigent circumstances, it has been defined that officers may conduct a warrantless search if the circumstances are sufficiently compelling to make resort to a warrant both impracticable and risky, and the police had probable cause to believe that items relating to crime would be found or that the suspect had committed a crime. Circumstances which might create such exigency are flight of the suspect, destruction of the evidence, hot pursuit, and danger to lives, even the life of the suspect. Again, officers can do a warrantless search if circumstances sufficiently indicate that it's compelling to resort to such a search without a warrant. Then that if you were to get a warrant, it would be impractical and it would also be risky. And the police, number one, must have probable cause to believe that items relating to the crime would be found or that evidence of a crime has been committed, or that there is evidence that a crime has been committed. The first one that we talked about, the first one we mentioned was hot pursuit. Hot pursuit basically is when officers are in immediate and continuous pursuit of a suspect. It is unrealistic to expect officers to stop in the middle of a chase and resort to the warrant process. Officers must have probable cause to believe that the suspect has committed a crime. There must be immediate and continuous pursuit of the suspect from the scene of the crime. And officers must have probable cause to believe that the suspect is in the particular dwelling. And so two things are required if you're going to say that there's exigent circumstances in reference to hot pursuit. Three things really. There must be immediate and continuous pursuit of the officers from the scene of the crime, from the officers of the suspect, I should say, from the scene of the crime. The officers must have probable cause to believe that the person has committed a crime. And the officers must have probable cause to believe that the person is inside the dwelling. For instance, officers get information that the person is inside the dwelling, but the information comes from someone they don't, with little credibility, or that's an anonymous call. They don't have information as to whether the person actually has frequented this particular place, this particular home, or whether he actually has ever lived in this particular home. The officers will not be able to go to that home without a warrant because they must have probable cause to believe that the person is inside of the home. That is, there must be some reason to lead, some probable reason to lead the officers to believe that the person is inside of the home before they can enter that home and under hot pursuit. But under hot pursuit, remember, it's immediate and continuous. It's an immediate and continuous pursuit of the suspect after a crime has been committed. And thus, that probably is not going to be a problem in reference to hot pursuit. The problem will probably come in when we talk about hot pursuit is whether the suspect has actually committed a crime and whether there was immediate and continuous pursuit. For instance, let's assume that officers get a call that a person was engaged in a bank robbery. 5 minutes after they get a call from someone who has followed the person that was engaged in a bank robbery to a particular home. And the person tells officers that the person who's engaged in a bank robbery is in this particular home. Now, the officers cannot say that they have exigent circumstances as a result of a hot pursuit, even though the officers would have been pursuing the suspect. But hot pursuit is just what it says, that there's a hot pursuit of the suspect. Let's move on to the next one. Police and public safety. Officers can enter a home. They can enter a person's abode if the circumstances indicate that there is a risk of safety to either the police or to the public. A warrant is excused if the delay in obtaining a warrant would result in a significant risk of harm to the police or to members of the public. Exigency is determined as of the time of the police action, not in hindsight. The threat of danger must be immediate. And so the exigency, in order to determine whether there's a threat to the public or to the police, must be determined at the time that the police take the action. We can't look at hindsight. We can't go and say, we can't enter the home and then say there was a danger. When the officer get in, danger occurs. The danger has to occur before the officer actually goes into the home. There must be a dangerous situation for the police officers. There must be a dangerous situation for someone in the home. For instance, officers get a call, a credible call, that a gun has been shot. There's been several gunshots in a particular home. Exigent circumstances. Exigent circumstances, why? Because public safety, safety of the persons inside of a home, and thus officers can enter that home. Officers can enter that home, but the threat of danger must be immediate. Let's assume that the call came in, say, at 5 o'clock. Officers do not arrive at the home until 11 o'clock that evening. The threat of danger has, at that particular point, probably has dissipated. The threat of danger must be an immediate threat of danger to someone in that home. They get the call, immediately they go out. Then, if officers have indication that there is someone in the home, that there may be someone in the home who's harmed, then they can enter that particular home. Public safety is one that is practically used all of the time as an exception, generally, to some of the warrantless entries. That there was a reason that that the public was in, that officers was in fear that someone had a gun, officers in fear that someone could have been injured, and always the officer's safety. The officer's safety is primary. That officers can enter the home if there is reason to believe that their safety is compromised. The next reason that officers can enter into a home or into a person's place of abode is risk of destruction of the evidence. If evidence will be destroyed in time it takes to obtain a warrant, then the warrant requirement is excused. To determine whether the officers are confronted by an urgent need to render aid or take action, courts have looked at the factors stated in Dorman versus United States, which is a federal court case, and we'll talk about that case in a minute. The Dorman factors are the gravity of the offense with which the suspect is charged. What type of crime is the suspect charged? Whether the suspect is reasonably believed to be armed. A clear showing of probable cause to believe the suspect has committed a crime. Number 4, strong reason to believe that the suspect is on the premises. Number 5, a likelihood that the suspect will escape if not quickly apprehended. And number 6, the peaceful circumstances of the entry. And so in order for the officers to enter into a home based on the risk of destruction of evidence, they must first you consider the crime, whether the evidence can be quickly destroyed before the officers can get a warrant. Next, you look to whether the suspect would probably be dangerous, armed and dangerous. Next, if there's a clear showing that the suspect is committing a crime or has committed a crime, and strong reason to believe the suspect is on the premises, and the fact that if they don't enter now, the suspect will not be apprehended. The suspect may escape. The officers cannot create exigent circumstances. Their entry must be peaceful, that is, their entry must be lawful. They cannot act in such a manner that create exigent circumstances which will permit the search. They cannot impermissibly create exigent circumstances. When law enforcement agents act in an entirely lawful manner, they do not impermissibly create exigent circumstances. We'll look at that in 1 second when we look at Dorman. Law enforcement agents are required to be innocent but not naive. Now let's take a look at a couple of cases, if you will, please, to kind of explain these factors and give you an idea of how these factors work, how exigent circumstances work. Let's look at the first case, United States. I said Dorman, but we're going to look at United States versus McDonald. United States versus McDonald can be found at 916 Federal 2nd, 766. 916 Federal 2nd, 766. And the facts of the case are: an informant alerted the task force of a possible narcotics operation utilizing 2 apartments in a Manhattan apartment building. Agents of the task force established surveillance outside the apartment building. The agents observed several indications that a retail narcotic exchange was being operated out of apartment 10. One of the officers from the task force went to the apartment in an attempt to transact an undercover purchase. When the agent entered the apartment, he encountered Paul Thomas, who was sitting in a chair next to the door and pointing a cocked 9mm gun. Defendant was sitting on the sofa counting money. That is, McDonald was sitting on the sofa counting money. There were 3 to 4 of the men in the apartment. The agent bought a $5 bag and left the building to report his observations to the other people in the field, the other officers in the field. 10 minutes after the buy, the agent returned to the apartment with other officers. After knocking on the door and identifying themselves, the agents heard the shifting of feet. They simultaneously received the radio communication that the occupants of the apartment were trying to leave through a back window. The agents used a battering ram to force their way into the apartment. The agents arrested 5 men in the apartment and did a security sweep. They discovered in plain view 2 loaded weapons, large quantities of cocaine and marijuana, narcotics paraphernalia, and several $1,000s. The court held, applying the dormant factors, they found that exigent circumstances existed. It stated that the ongoing sale of narcotics was a grave offense. The suspects were armed. The officers had probable cause to believe that a crime was being committed. There was a likelihood that the suspects might escape, and the agents acted in accordance with the law. In addition, the court found that the agents needed to prevent the possible destruction of evidence. Okay, and so what they said here is that probable cause existed because of the possible destruction of evidence, that cocaine, drugs can be easily dispensed if you wait to get a warrant. And also, they heard the rumbling of the feet, the shuffling of the feet, which would indicate that people are trying to destroy the evidence. And also, they got information, credible information, that some of the people in the apartment were trying to escape out of the window. And thus, the officers, for 2 reasons, in order to apprehend the suspects and prevent the flee of the suspects, and secondly, for the purposes of preventing destruction of the evidence, the officers had that there were exigent circumstances for us to enter without a warrant. Now, let's look at it. Let's look at those factors again. Let's look at the dormant factors. Remember the dormant factors. At first, we look at the offense. There was a grave offense that was going on. They were selling marijuana. Second, were the suspects armed? Yes, we had a man with a 9mm sitting at the door with a 9mm. The officers had probable cause that the crime was being committed. Yes, they had credible information from an undercover agent who had just 10 minutes before bought drugs from the people inside of the apartment. There was a likelihood that suspects might escape. Yes, they heard people trying to go out of the window, or they got a credible report that people were trying to go out of the window of their apartment. The agents acted in accordance with the law. Yes, they knocked, they announced, they waited, they heard the scuffling, they heard the sound of the feet shuffling, they got the information that someone was trying to escape, and thus they acted. And therefore, they acted in accordance with the law because they said there was exigent circumstances. But hold on a second here. Hold on 1 second. Because we know that the officers, so we said the officers cannot impermissibly create the exigency. They cannot impermissibly create the exigency. In McDonald, the defendant argued that the officers impermissibly created exigent circumstances when they knocked on the door with the agent that had just bought drugs from the apartment. They're saying, the defendant is saying, that they saw the agent who had just bought the drugs come up with uniformed officers. And at that particular point, they used that agent in order to force the people on the inside, or to cause a commotion of the people on the inside, because once they saw this agent or this person coming back with armed police officers, all of a sudden they noticed something is going on. And so they are saying that the officers impermissibly created the exigency. by bringing the person along with them who had just come in to buy the drugs. Let's listen to what the court said in reference to that. The court found exigent circumstances are not to be disregarded simply because the suspects choose to respond to the agent's lawful conduct by attempting to escape, destroy evidence, or engage in any other unlawful activity. The fact that the suspects may be reasonably expected to behave illegally does not prevent law enforcement agents from acting lawfully to afford the suspects the opportunity to do so. When law enforcement agents act in an entirely lawful manner, they do not impermissibly create circumstances. Law enforcement agents are required to be innocent, but not naive. Thus, they can use ploys, they can use tactics for the purposes of creating the exigency, but they cannot impermissibly create the exigency. When do they impermissibly create the exigency? When they do something unlawful. As long as they operate within the law, if they operate within the law for the purposes of getting the person to react, and remember the subjective intent of officers does not matter. And so they can have subjectively, or they can subjectively want to create the exigency. But as long as they operate within the law, they're going to be fined, and the law would find that they did not create the exigency. Law enforcement agents are required to be innocent, but not naive. The fact that the suspects may reasonably be expected to behave illegally does not prevent law enforcement agents from acting lawfully to afford the suspects the opportunity to do so. And so they can do something for the purpose of causing exigency as long as it's legal, is within the law. One more case I want to take a look at, a couple more. The next one is Brigham versus City of Stewart. Very interesting case. This case dealt with whether there was a safety concern within inside of a home, and officers had the right to go inside of the home because of a safety concern. The facts are, four police officers responded to a call regarding a loud party at a residence. When they arrived, they heard shouting from inside and proceeded down the driveway to investigate. They observed two juveniles drinking beer in the backyard. They entered the backyard and saw through a door and windows an altercation taking place in the kitchen. Four adults were trying to subdue a juvenile without success. When the juvenile struck one of the officers in the mouth, an officer entered the home and announced the police presence. The respondents were arrested and charged with contributing to the delinquency of juvenile, disorderly conduct, and intoxication. Respondents filed a motion to suppress all evidence obtained after the officers entered the home. Their argument is the warrantless entry violated the Fourth Amendment. At the state level, they won. The respondent posited two reasons why the officers' entry was unreasonable. First, they argued that the officers were not interested in saving lives, but in making an arrest. They said that the officers were not interested in saving lives, but they were interested in making an arrest. Now, we know what the answer to that is, right? It doesn't matter what the officer's interest was. Wren tells us that the subjective intent of the officer does not matter. As long as the officer does what? You got it. He acts legally. As long as he acts legally. The court found that an action is reasonable under the Fourth Amendment regardless of the officer's state of mind, as long as the circumstances viewed objectively justified the action. The court distinguished administrative or programmatic searches that require an inquiry into programmatic purpose. It stated this inquiry is directed at ensuring that the purpose behind the program is not ultimately indistinguishable from the general interest in crime control. It has nothing to do with discerning what is the mind of the individual officer conducting a search. And so they distinguished an administrative search from what was going on here. The court actually said that, again, the officer's mindset, their subjective intent does not matter. As long as the circumstances indicate, as long as the circumstances viewed objectively justify that the action was legal. Here, the officers may have wanted to go in for an arrest, but that is not the question. That is not the issue. Second, the respondents argued that their conduct was not serious enough to justify officers' intrusion. And that's where the question really comes in, because here the officers are saying that because of what we saw the juvenile hit one person. They were trying to subdue the juvenile. They couldn't subdue the juvenile. Then the juvenile hit a person inside of a home. At this particular point, there was a danger to the person inside of a home. That safety was an issue. And thus they had to enter the home for the purpose of gaining control in order to make certain that the situation was a safe situation, in order to stop the fight, so to say. Now, the people are inside of their home, they're having a party, they're drinking, it's family, they're in an argument. Now, officers say that we go in for the purposes of public safety. Be that as it may, let's see what the court said. The respondents asked the court to consider Welch, where the court held that a person suspected of DUI did not present an exigency that permitted a warrantless entrance into a home. The court distinguished the case. The only potential emergency confronting the officer was the need to preserve evidence. In Welch, it was a DUI. And they said the person inside the home, officer was going to go in, the exigent they said was preserve evidence, and so the evidence would not be destroyed. The person was drunk, purportedly drunk. The officers could not go in the home for the purpose of preserving that particular evidence, because whatever the evidence it was, it probably been dissipated, or the officers had time to get a warrant. And so they distinguished that Welch doesn't apply here. In these circumstances, the court said, the officers had an objectively reasonable basis for believing both that the injured adult might need help and that the violence was not just beginning. Nothing in the Fourth Amendment required them to wait until another blow was rendered. Thus, once that young man rendered one blow, the exigency arose then. The officers don't have to wait until the circumstances get dire, until they get out of hand. The moment they believe objectively, if it's viewed objectively, and they objectively believe that danger exists, the officers can enter. And again, Welch doesn't apply, because Welch is a totally different case. It dealt with a DUI, and thus the officer had the opportunity to get a warrant for the purposes of determining whether the person had committed a crime, whether the person or arresting the person, I should say. I apologize. They had an opportunity to get a warrant for the purpose of arresting the person. Okay, let's look at our last case, and then it'll be the end of our discussion of exigent circumstances. The next case is really interesting. How the court used exigent circumstances. In this particular case, officers were called to a home by a wife who was gathering her possessions, and she was leaving her husband. And she said that she wanted to do it peacefully, and I just need you all's protection to go into the home. When the officers got there, she said, he has drugs in the home. And the officers at that particular point, one of the officers left to go get a warrant in order to search the home based on information from the wife. But what the officers did, they stayed at the home. Two of the officers stayed at the home while the other officer went to get a warrant to search the home for the drugs that the wife said that he had inside of the home. Now, the officers stayed at the front door of the home. And the husband came on the porch. The officer told him he could not go back into the house. Husband went back several times with the officer standing at the door watching his movements. About 2 hours after leaving, the other officer returned with a search warrant and several other officers. The house was searched and drugs were found. They kept him on the porch. They would not allow him to go back in unless they could see him, and see his movements inside of the home. They didn't enter the home, but they somewhat retained him on the porch for the purpose of allowing the other officer to get the search warrant. And the court said that there were exigent circumstances. Listen to what the court said. The issue was whether the officers violated the Fourth Amendment when he prevented husband from re-entering home for 2 hours while the other officers obtained a search warrant. The warrantless seizure in this case involves a plausible claim of especially pressing or urgent law enforcement need, exigent circumstances. Moreover, the restraint was tailored to that need, being limited in time and scope and avoiding significant intrusion into the home itself. First, the police had probable cause to believe that MacArthur's trailer, his home, contained unlawful drugs. Second, the police had good reason to fear that unless restrained, MacArthur would destroy the drugs before they could return with the warrant. Third, the police made reasonable efforts to reconcile their law enforcement needs with the demands of personal privacy. They neither searched the trailer nor arrested MacArthur before obtaining a warrant. Fourth, the officers imposed the restraints for a limited period of 2 hours. This time period was no longer than was reasonably necessary for the officers to obtain a warrant. We have found no case in which this court has held unlawful a temporary seizure that was supported by probable cause and was designed to prevent the loss of evidence while the officers diligently obtained a warrant in a reasonable period of time. Two things here. They said that there was an opportunity for him to destroy the drugs if they allowed him to go back into the home. The second thing, the time limit was reasonable. They said that 2 hours was reasonable. They never truly defined or really gave us a definite time limit, but they said that this 2 hours was not unreasonable for the officers to get a warrant. And if they permitted him to go back into the home, that he had an opportunity to destroy the evidence. Thus, there were exigent circumstances to prevent him from going back into the home, destruction of evidence. They could have even gone further, that he could have obtained a gun or weapon while he went into the home. And thus, the officer had exigent circumstances in order to detain him until they got a warrant for his arrest. Now, that's the end of our discussion of exigent circumstances. Remember the dormant factors for exigent circumstances. Remember the reasons that exigent circumstances exist. Public safety and safety of the police, hot pursuit, destruction of evidence. Those are the three basic reasons for which we can have, for which exigent circumstances exist. The most prevalent one, the one that's used the most, public safety. Public safety is used the most. Destruction of evidence has been used on several occasions. Hot pursuit, easy, immediate, and continuous pursuit. And there's reasonable cause to believe the person has committed a crime, and there's reasonable cause to believe that he's inside of a home for hot pursuit. With that, we'll end this video at 27 minutes. Next video will be consent. Thank you. Goodbye.